Hello and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today we're going to be talking about container base images. So Nate, what is a base image?
Well, I mean, every container comes from somewhere, right? Do we need to have that conversation? Where do containers come from? It's an awkward one, right? Anyway, every container has to start somewhere, whether you're building your own base image or whether you're basing it on something else. And there's a bunch of popular ones out there. If you were unaware, though, Red Hat produces some for you, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and so we're going to be talking about the Red Hat Universal Base Image, or UBI. You can get it from Red Hat's container catalog or Docker Hub. And we'll talk about some like how we maintain them and other things as we move to the second part of the episode. But all of our builds and demos today are going to be based on the universal base image. So Nate, why don't we jump into the terminal and I'll just build a basic container off the base image.
Sounds like a good idea.
All right, so I'm going to use Builda, and I'm going to do this interactively. I know that Nate likes to do things from container files, and he will wow us with that in a bit.
Of course.
But I'm just going to do a Builda, and I'm pulling from the Red Hat container registry. That's why it's registry.access.redhat.com. But you can also get them from Docker Hub. In fact, when we switch, I'm going to talk some about the different options that you can use, and I'll show you like our container registry data and what it looks like over at Docker Hub. All right, so I did a build from, and I told it what base container to use, and so it pulled it down and it mounted it at this location. So when I'm building my container with interactive commands, this is the container name I'm going to use to interact with it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do for my web services container is I'm going to install Apache. So I'm going to do this build a run because I'm going to run a command within my operating container environment. I tell it which operating container environment to use, and then there's 2 dashes that separates the build a command from the command to execute within the container. So when we're watching this DNF install happen, it's actually being unpackaged and built inside of this mounted container image and container runtime that I've already got going. And this is going to be somewhat different based off the base image you may select, right? If you selected a base image that already had Apache installed in it, then you wouldn't have to install extra software in it potentially. But UBI, the base UBI that I'm using here, we call it the standard image, has some software, but if you want to do things with it, you'll install your own software on top of it. All right. Then I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to make sure that when the container runs, it's going to run Apache. So I'm going to enable, oops, hold on. It's the wrong thing.
Just install Apache a second time. That's fine. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Podman, when I use a container file, is actually just using Builda in the background anyway.
It is.
So it's really more or less just there for people who don't like change, like me, to keep using their old container file.
Yeah. All right. And container files are really handy for things like repeatability in your builds, right? You don't want to have to copy and paste a series of commands periodically to do your container build. So it basically, usually a container file gives you that repeatability where you can just execute it and things just happen. All right, so let me try that again.
Well, I mean, we'll see in my later demo that you can actually just throw it into a script. So really, there's not much. Well, go ahead, finish your demo. We'll talk about that later.
All right. So I configured my container so it'll listen on port 80. And when somebody hits port 80, they're going to get the init command, which is actually going to redirect them to Apache. And then I'm going to copy in my index file for my web content. Right, so I took my index HTML file, which looks like this, and I copied it inside of my container image, and I put it inside the container image at var www.html, which is where a web server would look for content. All right, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to commit my container. So what this is going to do is it's going to snap a copy of UBI working container, and it's going to call the resulting snapped copy EL-HTTPD. And so if we were to do a build a image list, I'll see that there's this container called EL-HTTPD sitting out there. And I can now run it. And I'm running it as root, which I know we all have opinions on, but I wanted to do something quick and easy for the critical path. So when I run it, I'm saying I want to run it detached. So I'm not going to have an interactive session for it. I'm doing a port mapping. So port 80 on the host maps to port 80 on the container. And EL-HTTPD is the container that I'm going to be running, listening on that port. All right, so if I now do a curl on localhost, there's my super businessy website running from within my container. Right, I can podman ps, right, and there's my container that's running.
Super businessy.
Right. So I picked UBI standard, which is just called UBI, because it's a multi-use image with things that one would need. But there's several other images, and we'll talk about how to work with those after the transition. Nate, any final parting words before we move to the?
There was, now you've cleared it, but there was a question from Shantanu about, there was a stat error, they said, in your output, and they're curious what that is.
There's a stat error in my output.
Yeah, I think it said something about not being able to find a file. I couldn't read it that closely because
that was a mistake. That was a typo on my part, right? So
okay, there you go.
Right there. So when I did my copy, I
there.
referenced this file name, but that's not what I called it. So
Okay.
I just took out the one, and then it was fine. And
I had missed that because I was trying to do other things like produce the show. So
yeah, there's that. All right. So don't forget to mash that like and subscribe. When we transition to the second part of the show, we're going to talk about the other UBIs. So there's 3 other ones besides the standard one.
We've got a whole family of UBIs.
Yeah, UBI Init, UBI Minimal, and UBI Micro. We'll talk about what they are and a little bit of differences between them and how one would work with them.
Yep, they've all got different sort of use cases and pluses and negatives. So yeah.
Yeah, so more building container demos when we come back.
Right after this. We need like an old school commercial break is what we really need.
I mean, you know, if we had sponsors, maybe we could do that.
No, I mean like totally like companies that don't exist anymore. 1950s, like a thing for Ovaltine just comes up on the screen, right?
Or maybe we need to make up our commercials.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. The shadowy shadow man of Red Hat. All right. So Nate, if you bring my screen back up, we'll move from.
I just turned it off. Now you want it back? My gosh.
Well, I'm going to move from the terminal to the other tabs that I have open. That's why I actually organized it this way today.
Oh, I was wondering why you were sharing the title bar and stuff. It's so
exactly.
There you go.
So when you go to the Red Hat container catalog and you look for UBI, and you see something similar when you go to Docker Hub, there's a whole bunch of different images. So we currently build images for RHEL 8 and 9 and 10 beta. And when you go to an individual one, this is the one for UBI standard, you can see a little bit of information about it. And the information that I think most people look at first is this stuff. How big is it? Right? So UBI is 85 megabytes compressed and 220 megabytes uncompressed. And if you look over here in the packages, like this is literally all of the RPMs that go into this package. And so there are 1,535 RPMs that more or less go into there. That's actually not quite accurate because you can see that there's like different architectures, which wouldn't really be germane for all UBIs. But anyway, it also shows you the packages. It also gives you a Docker file or a container file on building stuff. All right.
That's handy.
Yeah. And to get this image, you can download it. All right. But we mentioned before the break that there are more than one UBI flavor.
Mm-hmm.
So this is UBI standard. But if we look at UBI init, which Nate's going to do a demonstration on in a bit, what's the difference between UBI standard and UBI init, Nate?
So it's a very nuanced difference, but the core difference, right? Every container image has like a default command that it runs, right? So if you were to run UBI interactively, it'll get you to bash. The UBI init, its default command is actually sbin init, right? So it's actually both of these images contain systemd. UBI's is a little bit lighter weight. UBI inits is a little more similar to what you'd expect in a full deployment, like a full RHEL deployment. But the big difference is how you run the command or how you run the container once you've put your application inside of it, right? So both of them would let you do a systemctl enable on a service. But then at the end of a UBI command or container file or a builda, you'd have to tell it, okay, you're supposed to run init. That's your thing you're supposed to do. Whereas with the UBI image, it'll run init automatically. And I'll show you that when we do our demo of it.
Yeah. And so you can see that the UBI init image is slightly larger than the standard UBI. And if we look at packages, it's got a similar list of packages, but there's like slightly more of them.
Yeah, there's a couple extra tools that go along with a heavier weight systemd. Is what it comes down to.
Right. All right. Then we have, that's bigger than UBI standard. Then we can go the other way and go smaller. So I'm going to do a demo a little bit later on this one, which is UBI Minimal, right? And so what you see is it's smaller, right? 38 megs uncompressed, about 100 megs. I'm sorry, 38 megs compressed and about 100 megs uncompressed. But when we go over to the packages, it's got a lot less stuff. In fact, it does not come with, man, I cannot click today. It does not come with DNF to try and save space. It comes with an alternate tool called Micro DNF, and that's part of what I'm going to be showing you today. So to get it smaller, we give you less things.
Right.
And that's what makes it smaller. Less tools, less stuff built in by default. Now, can you install the things in addition to whatever your workload is? Yes. For DNF, for UBI Minimal, you have to use a special tool called Micro DNF in order to do those installations. For UBI regular and UBI init, you just use regular DNF for doing that. And then you have the last one, Micro. So Micro is very small because it is like 7 megabytes compressed and 22.5 uncompressed.
Micro is like the size uncompressed as the other images are compressed, which is crazy when you think about it.
Right. And so the reason it's so small is because there are, and I'm not kidding, 13 packages.
There's like nothing.
Yeah. Because the goal of this container image is to give you a bash shell.
Yeah.
That is, and so it requires 13 packages, the 13th of which is bash, to get you a bash shell. And so it's a very Alpine-like container experience.
Right.
So there are no niceties. It's like, Nate, you probably like living in a house because you like have, air conditioning and like temperature control. Right. You don't get wet when it rains and there's food in your refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
You got all these modern conveniences. That would be like the normal UBIs.
Right.
UBI Micro is like if Nate lived literally outside under a tree.
If it's like you have maybe a cot.
No, not even.
Not even a cot. There's no cot. It's like you've rolled up some moss as a pillow. That's your bed.
Exactly. You literally have to do everything. You have to find your own food. You have to like get rained on. You have to build your own shelter. Like everything.
But you still have air, which is really the requirement.
Yes, yes. And I guess if it's raining and you open your mouth, you get hydrated. But so we have this like very, very minimalistic experience, almost identical to the Alpine experience, which means that you also have to build it very differently than you do the others. The others you can build with like, oh, I'll just DNF install this thing. Not here. Doesn't come with DNF. And so Nate will be doing a quick demo of this a little bit later to show the, how do we put this? Starkness, severity, minimalism.
Minimalism. There you go.
Yeah.
It's
honestly,
minimalist.
Nate, when you build your container with this, are you going to hold up every package and go, does this package bring me joy?
I probably should. Shantanu compares Micro to like IKEA, but IKEA at least gives you a screwdriver in the box, right?
Exactly.
Micro doesn't. You have to fashion a screwdriver from rocks and sticks.
Yeah. Here's the saw. There is the forest. Go forth and cut down your lumber and make your thing. So that's kind of like what the family of UBI is. And over here on Docker Hub, that was my last tab. We also publish all these images over on Docker Hub. So you can go to Docker Hub and find them. You can get information on like their size and all the normal Docker Hubbery things. And there's some slight differences between Red Hat Container Catalog in terms of the metadata that's presented and Docker Hub. So
yeah, it's nice to have options.
It is. And there's also some other things that we do. But one of the big reasons why you use a base container image from somebody else is so that you don't have to manage it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of exactly why we have 4 different flavors of this thing, right? So that you don't have to go, oh, but UBI isn't quite right for me. Well, we give you 3 other flavors of UBI that might be right for you. And if they aren't, you could build it off of Micro, I suppose, and make it exactly what you want.
Right. Well, but it also gives you one other thing, which is you don't have to worry about the software that comes with UBI, because we worry about the software that comes with UBI.
Right.
Right. So if you were building all of your own container images with your own software stack, and a new version of Apache comes out because of an update.
Right.
Well, if you're maintaining your whole container catalog yourself, you have to pay attention to Apache and know that an update was produced, right? Whereas if you go with something like UBI, Red Hat is paying attention to Apache. And so Red Hat knows that the update has been produced, and we will rebuild the UBIs to account for it.
Right. So I guess the other thing we didn't really touch on is that we've also got some images that contain not just UBI, but UBI with some common services on it, like UBI HTTPD, UBI MariaDB, UBI MySQL, right? I don't have the whole container registry memorized, but there's a bunch out there, and you can find all of those in that same registry that Scott was showing off earlier. So those would be even more applicable, right? So if you're just basing your container on UBI and then you're installing HTTPD in it, which of course is going to be our example over and over and over again today, because that's what we do, you would have to remember to rebuild your base image or your HTTPD image whenever we release an update for Apache. If you're using the Apache container instead, the UBI HTTPD container, all you have to do is, periodically make sure that you're updating your application container, and it'll just pull in those bits from us, and then you'll have the latest.
Yeah, and in fact, we have this thing called FreshMaker that makes fresh images.
Yay.
And it does so every 6 weeks. So we put
that's good.
all the updates into the UBI containers every 6 weeks, unless there's a critical or important security vulnerability that happens to be in those packages.
I was just going to say, there must be an exception for criticals.
Yes. So if it's an important or critical security update that it gets published, even if it's between the 6-week rebuild cycle, we will generate a rebuild mid-cycle to go ahead and update the images and patch for them. And so that's like the true power of base images is make somebody else do the work, right? You manage your things, but make somebody else manage the operating system containery things that your thing relies on.
Right. You've got another demo coming up, don't you? For Minimal.
I do have a demo.
Or am I out of order? I think we're good. All right. You ready to do that? Should I bring your... Here we go.
Sure, we could do that.
You better be ready.
Why not? I'm ready now. All right. So the demo actually looks very similar to the demo I did for regular, right? Except for a couple of changes. One is when I do my build from, notice I'm building it from this UBI Minimal UBI image instead of just regular UBI with no extension. All right, so this pulls the smaller UBI Minimal container. And because it was named UBI Minimal, I get a different working container name. All right, so the other big change is to help make things smaller. UBI Minimal does not come with DNF. It comes with a different build of DNF called Micro DNF.
I was going to say, it sort of comes with DNF.
Yeah, so it does like all the things that you really care about with DNF, which is automatic dependency resolution and looking over multiple repos to find the transaction that it needs to put together across multiple repositories. So like the core functionality of DNF is there. But when I run this to install my Apache web server content into it, what we'll notice is before it was like, oh, I'm going out to contact this repository and that repository and, you know, checking stuff. I don't get any of those nice output messages. And then we do things like transactions, and it has like a status with hash marks where it shows me like how long the transaction it is. Not with DNF, with micro DNF, right? It's like, here's your transaction, here I'm doing the thing.
A lot of that output doesn't matter when you're in a container, right? So why include it if it's going to, even if it's just a couple of bits you've saved by changing the text output? But I'd imagine there's probably features of DNF, like, I don't know, rollback is an example I can think of, right? Or history. Like, I don't care about those in a container. So why would they be included? So I would guess that maybe things like that are what gets stripped out to really save space.
So I didn't check exactly those commands.
Right.
So I will not say, yes, that's exactly what happens. But you're right. We pull out certain functionality that is less core to DNF, right? The core thing is being able to look over multiple repositories, being able to configure multiple repositories, being able to do dependency resolution between them. All that is there in micro DNF. And then anything beyond that, like that's a target for potential removal from micro DNF to save space.
Right.
All right. So that's it. From here on out, it looks pretty much the same as before. Right. I'm going to grab my index HTML, but this time spell the right file name.
Good idea.
I'm going to configure my port. And then I'm going to go ahead and commit my image. All right, but this time I'm calling it ELHTTPD min. And then let me kill off my other container that I probably did not kill off.
Such a fun name to try to type.
Yeah.
You know, if you do a podman stop -a, it'll just stop all the running containers.
Thank you. That's great.
There you go. You're welcome.
All right, and then we'll go ahead and run my new container. And now when I do my curl, right, there's my super businessy website again, but now being served by a much smaller container with less software in it.
So there's a question from Shantanu. Actually, there's been a number of questions, but Billy's been doing a great job of answering a bunch of them. There's a question about SE Linux inside of a container. Like, basically, do you need SE Linux inside of the container? And I think there's labels that matter,
there
but
are
like full SE Linux isn't running in there. It's
well,
depending on the host for that.
right, because SE Linux is implemented in the kernel,
Right.
and the host's SE Linux policy.
Right.
The container doesn't run a kernel, so it's
Right.
not doing Linux policy enforcement. But things like its file system and having SE Linux labels on its file system and its processes so that the host's SE Linux policies can be applied is what's important there.
And there was another one about, do we publish the recipes somewhere to create the base images, right? So like, can someone just download, say, a container file or build a script that would go and build them UBI?
Yeah, so if you look over on the in the Red Hat container catalog at the UBI containers, here's
You go.
The Docker file that's used to build it.
So if you wanted something very similar to UBI, but not quite like UBI, you could grab this and customize it. But then I'd imagine you'd end up in a situation where that's not actually UBI. So any support that goes with it wouldn't be included because you've now modified it.
Right. Well, like most things Red Hat, right? When you build something yourself, then you're committing to manage and support it yourself.
So that's all stuff to keep in mind. It's the only reason I bring it up.
Right. And then talking about support, there's one more thing. You'll notice that when we look at the UBI images here, they all have a tag on them that say 9.5. So Red Hat will tag them with the version of RHEL that it was based off of. But UBI, because it's free and freely redistributable, lasts as long as a RHEL release active support, right? So when 9.6 comes out mid-year, we're going to stop building 9.5 because we're now building 9.6 images. And when 9.7 comes out, we're going to stop building 9.6 and start building 9.7. So recently I had somebody ask me about, they gave me a 9.3 image and they said, it's not getting updates anymore. What gives? And it's like, well, we stopped maintaining 3 images when 9.4 came out. So that's why you're not seeing any updates, because we stopped maintaining that version of the image. And we tag it so that somebody can, like, if they're based on a specific version of RHEL, they can kind of align with that versioning.
And realistically, that's the world you're supposed to live in with a container. You're not supposed to be afraid to apply those updates because you're supposed to be able to easily and quickly build a container based on the new software set, test it before it ever hits prod, right? And then fix your problems if there are any, which I'm going to guesstimate that there aren't going to be a lot of changes between 9.3 and 9.4 and 9.4 and 9.5. They're going to break your application as long as you're not doing anything super crazy, right?
Right.
But you have to change mindsets. Like you can't handcraft, lovingly care for this particular container because that's not the world containers are made to operate in. They're made to be disposable. They're made to be quickly updatable. They're made to be quickly rollbackable. As I'm making new words today. So that you don't have to be afraid to do updates.
Yeah, and there are some things that one could do if they had to operate that way. So in the example of, well, I have this old container, I don't want to maintain it. I was like, well, it was 9.4. 9.4 is a extended update. Was it EUS? Extended update support. Thank you. Release. So in theory, you could download 9.4 container image if it's running on RHEL that has the EUS channels enabled or repos enabled. UBI also will use the host's repositories.
Mm-hmm.
So you could disable the UBI repositories, only leaving the host repositories that are configured for EUS, and then you can continue to maintain that thing using the extended update support packages as time goes on. But like, it takes a lot of intentionality, like that, and you have to advance.
I'm going to say don't do that unless you have no other choice. because that sounds like a nightmare. Because now it's all on you to keep that thing maintained.
I mean, it's not great. Just gonna say, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's can we do it and should we do it? That's definitely a can we do it? Yes. Should we do it? Probably not.
All right. I think that's all the questions that I saw anyway. So next, I've finally got a demo. Bring up mine here. All right. So Scott's off the hook, I think, for the rest of the episode. I think the rest of them are mine, aren't they? So we talked about UBI init. And of course, Scott mentioned my container files here. So I made I forget the name of the directory. I put it in already. It's just called UBI-init. Okay, so we're going to open up this container file. And I'll just kind of show you the differences, right? So now imagine replacing these with the builda commands that Scott was using earlier. You'll have to translate that a bit in your head because I don't have the builda commands to compare to exactly. But what I'm doing here now, somebody will probably see this and say, you shouldn't do a container this way because I'm doing two services inside of one container. I'm doing this for a couple reasons. One, because it's impossible, one, because it is possible with this type of a container, right? It's not as easy to do with other container-based images. Some people have reasons to make this work this way. Sometimes you have it like a legacy application that you're just trying to get into a container. You really want to be able to run two services in the same container to keep things moving along. And this lets you do it, right? And it's also one of the big differences between UBI and UBI init is that you have this full init system to work with. So what I'm doing here is I'm basing my container on UBI-init instead of UBI like Scott did earlier. I'm doing a DNF install. I'm telling it to not install some extra things that we don't need, like docs, for example. You're never going to shell into your container and look up the man entries for HTTPD. So we don't need to install those docs. Let's save that space. And we're also telling it not to install weak dependencies, which your mileage may vary. This may break certain things, may not. I don't know. Something that you'd want to consider. You don't have to do this one if you don't want to. And we're installing both HTTPD and MariaDB. Right? We're going to put on the MariaDB server as well. Then we're going to clean DNF, again, just to save space. Then we're going to expose two different ports, 80 and 3306, which of course are both HTTPD and MariaDB/MySQL's port. Then the last thing we're going to do here, notice I'm not telling it what to run at the end, right? This is not telling it to run this as the entry point or as the command for the container. This is telling it to run this command within the build environment. I don't do anything after this. And that's because of the way UBI init works. So I'm just saying run a systemctl command to enable both HTTPD and MariaDB. And then I'm done. And the reason I'm doing that is because the big difference, in my opinion, between UBI and UBI init is not just that UBI init has a more fully featured init, more fully featured systemd init. It also by default will run sbin init, right? So that's like really the core difference in my opinion here. So we don't have to tell it to run init because it's going to do that by default. Now, what we're going to do is build from this. So podman build -t is we're tagging the container. This is basically how you name the container. We're going to call it my init, I guess. And then the working directory to build from, which is the directory that I'm in. And you're going to see it go and do all those things. And then we're going to have a container image that we can build, or we can actually run from. And I'll run it and I'll show you that both of those things are running, although we can't do a whole lot with them because I didn't copy in a website like Scott was fancier than me in his demos. We're going to get the basic default Apache page.
Yeah, I put that effort in, Nate, so I could get super businessy website.
You did super businessy. So I did pre-pull the UBI images so we don't have to wait for those to download, but unfortunately we have to wait for the downloads of the packages. So that's just the way it is. Here we go. Shouldn't take too much longer. But you can see this is the difference here between the container file and a builda script. Now my next demo is going to use a builda script, right? Not interactively. It's through a bash script that I wrote so that I don't typo it. All right, it's done installing the packages. Next, it's going to run those commands and the exposes and whatnot that I told it to run. See, it created symlinks for the systemd services that it's going to start. Now, if I run a new container, we're going to run it in the background. We're going to give it a name. I don't know. Totally off the top of my head. It's the super creative my init container. This way I can identify it later. We're going to tell it to remove it when it's done. This isn't necessary, but I just want to try to keep Podman clean because I have another demo after this one. And then we're going to say expose these ports, -P. We're going to go 8080 to port 80. I guess I could use 80 since I'm running as root. And then we're going to do 3306. Okay, and then my-init is the name of the image that we just made. So we're going to run it like that. You can see now if I do a podman ps, there it is running. Right? You can see it's been up for a whole 3 seconds. Now, if I do a curl, what did I say, 8080? Now we're going to get, what did I do wrong? Oh, 8080. There's the default web page from Apache. So yay, that much is working. But the cool thing here is that if I do a MariaDB-H, now remember, I didn't do anything with MariaDB. It has like a basic config. There's no authentication set up. So it's going to reject me, but you're going to see a rejection from MariaDB, which is the important thing here. Right. It's instead of saying it couldn't connect to the host, it's saying that it's not allowed to connect, which means that I connected to MariaDB within my container. MariaDB said, I don't know who you are. You can't connect to me. And it rejected me. Right. So that means that both of these services are actually running within that container, which again, not usually the way people tell you should run containers. But if you have a reason to do it, you can do it this way with the UBI init, which I kind of like. I like having options. How about you, Scott?
I like having one option only.
Only one?
Like the Highlander, there can be only one.
There can be only one option. All right. So any questions about init before we move on? I could just move on to my next demo if we don't have anything.
Nope,
I wasn't really watching chat.
No.
Awesome. So the next thing we're going to tackle is UBI Micro.
Oh, Micro. Woof. Nate, you like living rough.
Yeah, well, somebody said, I'll take these 2 demos and you can do Micro. So here I am.
Is that really how it went down? I remember it slightly differently.
That's kind of how it went down. Because remember, I said something like, wait, why are we using Micro? That's the hardest one to do. All right. So here, I'll open up in Vim so we get some syntax highlighting. If I could type. All right, so this is a build-a script, right? And a build-a script is really just a bash script that calls a bunch of build-a commands. I don't know if there's a better way to automate build-a or not. This is how I did it. We actually have an example that was written in the RHEL 8 days of how this works with Micro, because that's when UBI Micro came out, and people were like, how do I use this thing? So here we are. What we're doing here is we're setting some variables. One of which is, hey, we need you to like build a container using UBI Micro. That's what this first one is here. It actually executes this command, which is really hard to read because it's red. I'm sorry. And then it puts the output into this variable, which we are going to use again. I think it's the name of the whatever. It's a pointer that gets me back to that particular build instance. And then we tell it we're going to mount the file system from this container that's running inside of build-a externally to the host that we're running all these commands on, right? And that's important because remember we said there's no DNF in there. There's no package manager in there because what'd you say, 13 packages, Scott? Yep. How could I do? There's probably more than 13 packages that come in as requirements for DNF, right? So there's really no way that we could include DNF in a container image that tiny. So, but you have to be able to install things some way, right? Now, there's 2 options I can think of. One would be you have a compiled code base that you've compiled and you're just copying in, right? Like that's one way to get that done. The other way is I'd really like to use these supported packages from Red Hat how do I use DNF? Well, the way to do that is you use DNF commands and you say, use this other route for where you're putting the output of these commands, right? So we're going to put them into the root of the container that we just opened up inside of Builda. So there's like this running container image that Builda's like, yeah, we're working on this thing. Well, there's like a virtual file system that goes along with that. And we're telling DNF, use that virtual file system instead of the host that I'm running it on. And then these commands run on the host, but they point to this other root, right? So keep that in mind. And then really we're just telling it what, sorry, go ahead.
So Nate, just a couple of quick things. So
Sure.
that micromount variable that you created. So all the other examples that we've used thus far, when we did the build a from and it created our working container, it had that mount somewhere. And so when we were using other commands, it was working with that directory.
Right.
But we didn't have to specify that directory because we would use things like build a run and then the command we wanted to run within that environment.
Right.
But there is no environment other than a bash shell.
Right.
So
exactly.
all of our additional commands, we have to be like, oh, no, not in the host. And this command that I'm trying to use doesn't exist in the environment. So I'm going to run it on the host, but actually do all the file operations over there. And that's why we have to track that mount point.
Right.
They got created automatically, but we didn't have to track in any of the other examples because we had nicer tooling.
Right. Right. So then we're setting the release version, which is the same between my container host and my container image. But if it's not, you want to make sure you set this. In this case, I know it's UBI 9, so I'm setting the release version to 9. If you were building like, I don't know, a UBI 8 on a UBI 9 host, then that would be different. I don't think I wanted to try that anyway. So anyway, I'm setting the release version just to be safe here. And then we're doing the same thing we did before. We're stripping out some things because this is a UBI Micro. Why would we want to fluff it up with a whole bunch of extra stuff that we don't need, like documentation and whatnot? So we're doing those same things about not including the docs and not including the weak dependencies. I have to look into a little bit more about what a weak dependency is. I guess these are probably things that are maybe not 100% required by the package we're installing, but are usually good to haves. Am I reading that right? I don't know.
It's things that are often installed together, but aren't
right.
absolutely required.
Right. Okay, and then we're just going to install HTTPD, right? Then we're going to clean out DNF, same way we did with the other one. Then we're going to do these build commands to unmount that temporary directory structure that we mounted in order to do the DNF stuff. Then we're going to run some commands on this build. One of them is, what command do you run when you run this container? And that's just like in the UBI init, how we told it, we don't care, just run init because that's the default. In this case, the default would have been bash, and we don't want bash because bash isn't going to run Apache. So we're telling it, run HTTPD and run it in the foreground, right? And then, of course, what port we want it to expose, ADTCP, because this is Apache, and that's what it listens on. Okay, and then we commit all of it at the end, which, again, these are commands that Scott was doing earlier, so these shouldn't be that big of a surprise. Okay, now we're going to run this. So we're just going to go micro builda. And it's going to do, you know, similar output to what we saw earlier, minus the MariaDB stuff, because we're not doing that here. And that's another key. There's no init system here. So you cannot, unless you were to install an init system, you cannot run two services inside of this thing. You'd be running exactly what it is that I called in that CMD, you know, as the run command.
Yeah, and so Nate, after this transaction, we're up to 110 packages in our micro. And there gets to be a point where, like, once you put all the stuff back in that you need, micro and regular UBI or minimal start to look really similar.
Yeah. Well, what we can do is I have all these images. We'll do a Podman image list after we're done building this, and we'll compare. How's that sound?
Okay.
So, all right, it's cleaning up DNF, and there we go. So now if I do a Podman image list, nope, image has an E in it. You can see I grabbed all the different UBIs because I wasn't sure which ones I was going to need for all my demos today. But so we have a good comparison of all of them here, right? So UBI init is 251 meg. Now this is the uncompressed size, right? This isn't the compressed size that Scott was talking about earlier. And you can see UBI Micro is 23.5, right? So pretty tiny. And now all I did was add Apache to it, right? And now here it is 161 meg, right? Because you install software, it takes up space. But the init one that I built earlier started at what, 251 meg. Now I installed two services here, Apache and MariaDB, and that's 619 meg, right? So you can see how these quickly add up when you're adding in all these different pieces of software.
Yeah, Nate, if we toggle screen shares, I pulled up the same list for me.
Wrong share. What are you breaking, Scott? There we go.
This is why I can't be the producer. All right. So Minimal was 102 megabytes natively. And then when we added Apache to it, it was 364. And regular UBI was 234. And when we added Apache to it, it was 451. Right. So
there you go.
UBI and UBI init are pretty close. And then the rest are like, a couple hundred meg difference. So anyway.
Yeah, UBI and UBI init are like, I don't know, 25 meg different. No, 15 meg different. So. All right. Well, let me finish up my demo here. Oh, you brought it back. Thank you very much. Okay. So now let's just run the container because that's the last thing that we can do here. Let's clear the screen off. Podman run it in the background. Give it a name. Wait, what did I call the container, Scott? I don't remember. It's called UBI Micro HTTPD. That should be easy enough to remember, right? Just a couple of dashes in the middle. Podman run -d name. Just call it micro so it's easy to find later. We're going to put in that port 8080 to 80, and then we're going to do UBI. Nope, not YBI. UBI Micro HTTPD. And this should run it, right? Podman PS. There we go. We've got it up and running. Now if I do that curl command from earlier, should get us the same thing because we're on the same port. There we go. Same deal. But the container image is that much smaller, which to some people is super important, right? This means that it's going to be easier to do polls and whatnot for this container image. It's going to take up less storage space as you have more and more versions of it sitting around as your workflows are bringing in new versions of it. And all around, it's just more efficient, right? So some people really care a whole lot about that. And that's what Micro is for, even if you don't, as long as you don't mind all the extra work it takes to build your images.
Right. If you don't like living hard, like living easy, use one of the other UBI images. Again, Minimal is I think it was less than 100 megs different once we had this stuff.
Yeah, I think honestly, now that I've worked with all of them, I've never touched Micro before. So today was like the day that I learned how to use it. I don't hate it, but it sure is more complicated. I really think that Minimal is a great middle of the road, right? Unless you need an init system or a more fully featured RHEL box. I think Minimal is the way to make this stuff happen.
Yeah. So that kind of runs us off the end of our prepared remarks. I don't see any questions. So Nate, are we back next week?
I think we're back next week. It's not some weird holiday or something, is it?
I don't think so.
I don't think it's a holiday, but we don't have a plan, do we?
We'll figure it out this week. I am sure.
Next week, more RHEL. I think that's safe. That's safe to say.
Don't forget to mash that like and subscribe button. We'll see you next week for another Into the Terminal, where we will probably go into the terminal, unless it's like web console or something like that.
Talk about RHEL.
Yep. So until next time, we will see you all on the flippity floppity.
Wow. Okay, Scott. Have a great one, folks. Have a good weekend.